On live television, the energy in the studio shifted the moment the guest began to speak. It wasn't just another talking point or rehearsed line. It was a moment of sheer clarity that cut through the noise like a blade. The conversation had been meandering through typical talking points, but then, with precise delivery, the guest dropped a statement that no one in the room was prepared for. It wasn't laced with political fluff or sugar-coated commentary. It was raw, undeniable truth aimed directly at the heart of a carefully protected narrative. The tone wasn't angry or aggressive. It was calm, calculated, and devastatingly effective. Every word seemed to land with weight, peeling back layers of distortion and exposing a reality that mainstream voices had long tried to bury. There was no dodging it. No spin could shield the moment from the audience watching. And it showed. The others on set froze, unsure of how to respond. The host, usually composed and quick-witted, faltered, caught off guard by the sheer straightforwardness of the claim. The confidence in the delivery made it clear. This wasn't speculation. This was backed by first-hand experience, documents, and knowledge that could not be ignored. The focus turned immediately to accountability. Not vague critiques or general complaints. This was about naming exactly who had pulled the strings behind the scenes and how deeply entrenched certain powers had become. It was a mirror held up to the system. And for the first time in a long while, someone was willing to describe what they saw without fear or filter. You could feel the discomfort rise in the room. The tension was no longer theoretical. It was visible, gripping everyone present. This wasn't a planned segment that could be dismissed or laughed off. This was truth spoken in the one place, where it was least welcome. For those who had grown used to dominating the conversation, it was jarring. The expected rhythm of control had been broken. No one cut him off. They couldn't. Not yet. The moment was too sudden, too explosive. The viewers watching from home weren't just hearing a different perspective. They were watching someone challenge the very machinery that decides what narratives are allowed and which ones are buried. What made it even more powerful was the way the speaker didn't flinch. No nervousness, no retreat. Just steady eye contact and factual delivery. It was a stark contrast to the deflections and moral grandstanding that usually occupy that kind of airtime. Here was someone who had walked through the corridors of power, seen what most Americans never do, and was now pulling the curtain back live in front of everyone. The studio's silence spoke volumes. You could hear the hesitation as the camera panned. The crew didn't know whether to pivot or let it continue. For once, a carefully choreographed program had slipped into reality, and the truth, so often buried in edits or muted in post-production, was out in the open. The usual buzz of counter-arguments was absent. No one dared go toe-to-toe with the clarity and specificity being laid out. The most stunning part wasn't just what was said, it was the reaction. Or more accurately, the lack of it. The guests on set looked as if they'd been blindsided. They had walked into the segment with the confidence of those who assume the deck is stacked in their favor, but as the truth poured out, their expressions shifted from smug certainty to quiet panic. Eyes darted, lips tightened. It was a masterclass in body language. The message had landed, and it shook the room. In a space where narratives are often manufactured and uncomfortable facts are diluted or dismissed, the sudden introduction of unfiltered truth was seismic. The audience at home could sense the shift. It was the kind of moment that reverberates, not because it was loud, but because it was real. The kind of moment that can't be undone with spin or clever phrasing. And so it lingered. The moment expanded beyond the seconds it took to speak. The words. It echoed through the silence that followed, through the awkward glances, through the inability to respond. It revealed with brutal honesty just how fragile the illusion of control really is when it's confronted with someone who knows exactly what they're talking about and refuses to stay quiet. The moment the truth was spoken, the entire atmosphere changed, not just in the studio, but in the expressions of those seated across the table. It was as if time paused for a brief second, just enough for the weight of what was said to fully register. And that's when it happened. The carefully composed face that had so often appeared confident, even smug, began to shift. First, it was in the eyes, widening ever so slightly, searching for some kind of anchor. Then the corners of the mouth, once turned upward in habitual superiority, faltered. The transformation was slow but undeniable. You didn't need words. The reaction said everything. This was a man who had grown used to being the loudest voice in the room. Someone accustomed to dominating discussions, guiding narratives, and never being questioned in a way that truly rattled him. But this wasn't the usual controlled environment. He had just been confronted with something he couldn't spin or dodge. The discomfort was written across every inch of his face, betraying the internal panic brewing beneath the surface. What made the moment so revealing was the sheer contrast between what was expected and what actually happened. There had been an air of confidence walking into the discussion. He was likely anticipating the same old routine, a few talking points, some applause, and an easy win. But as the truth began to unfold, as details were laid out with clarity and force, his demeanor collapsed. No amount of prepared lines or studio lighting could hide the fact that he was completely thrown off. The camera didn't miss it either. Every twitch, every forced blink, every subtle muscle tightening was captured in high definition for the world to see, and viewers knew. You could feel the collective recognition among those watching. This wasn't the face of someone disagreeing. This was the face of someone who'd just been exposed, someone who realized he'd lost control of the moment. The words had landed, and there was no safe way to respond. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to deflect right away because he couldn't. The shock was too fresh. Instead, he sat there in an awkward stillness, trying to recalibrate. But the attempt at recovery only made things worse. A few seconds later, a faint smile crept in, thin and unconvincing, clearly meant to mask the unease. But it didn't fool anyone. It looked more like a wince than a smile, a desperate effort to maintain composure while everything inside was scrambling for footing. Even the usual fallback, humor, or sarcasm was absent. For a moment, he was human in the most vulnerable way. Stripped of his persona, stripped of his rehearsed outrage, and laid bare by a few undeniable facts spoken calmly across from him. It wasn't just about being challenged. He had been blindsided, and that kind of reaction can't be faked. You can't rehearse what to do when you're caught off guard with a truth you hoped would never be mentioned. Those who knew him well, or had followed him for years, could see the difference instantly. This wasn't the bold speaker they were used to. This wasn't the firebrand with the quick comebacks and dramatic flair. This was someone who'd been cornered by reality, not rhetoric. And he knew it. He was sitting in a studio under hot lights with cameras rolling, and the truth sitting across from him like a loaded weapon. There was no way to escape. And still, the moment dragged on. Every second that passed was like a spotlight growing brighter, not on the speaker, but on his face. The one face that had said so much over the years, through documentaries, through interviews, through speeches, was now saying something entirely different. Not through words, but through silence, through expression, through the kind of stunned stillness that only comes when someone realizes they're not in charge of the room anymore. That brief, painful silence after the truth was spoken was more powerful than any monologue. It was the pause where everyone watching could read the truth, not in a headline, not in a tweet, but on his face. And no matter how he tried to recover in the moments that followed, the damage was done. The mask had slipped, the panic had surfaced, and the audience. There's a moment in live television when the control room starts to panic, and you can feel it even without seeing what's going on behind the scenes. The tension becomes almost tangible. That's exactly what happened when the segment took an unexpected turn. The guest wasn't following the script. He wasn't playing along with the safe, polished, politically correct exchange that was expected. Instead, he launched into a calm but searing revelation that struck at the heart of everything the network had tried to control for years. The people in charge knew it. You could sense their urge to cut the feed or redirect the conversation, but it was already too late. The truth had been spoken. Not whispered, not hinted at, but laid out clearly and confidently, and no one was ready for it. Especially not the producers who pride themselves on keeping a tight grip on the narrative. They had orchestrated a segment they thought they could Manage, one where the boundaries were clear, the tone was predictable, and any uncomfortable facts could be brushed aside. But they hadn't counted on someone walking in with the courage to shatter that illusion live and without hesitation. As the words continued, the initial shock turned into visible chaos just outside the frame. The camera angles started to shift, more frequently, almost nervously. The audio levels wobbled as if someone was hovering over the mute button, unsure of whether to press it. There were attempts to subtly interrupt the flow, but nothing worked. The truth kept coming, measured, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. The message wasn't wrapped in outrage or sensationalism. That's what made it even more powerful. It was simply the facts, delivered with conviction, backed by experience, and beyond the reach of typical rebuttals. Inside the studio, you could almost hear the unspoken commands flying through headsets. Someone was likely yelling in the control room, trying to decide whether to go to commercial or kill the segment. But the damage was done. Once a truth like that is spoken out loud, in front of a national audience, it can't be unsaid. The words had already found their way into living rooms, phones, and minds across the country, and they were sticking. The usual tactics were useless. There was no time to spin it, no pre-written statement that could smooth it over. What had been said wasn't a misstep or a gaffe. It was a calculated unveiling of something deeply uncomfortable for those used to shaping public perception. And it had been done in such a way that any attempt to censor it would only draw more attention. The other guests on set began to shift in their chairs. A host who normally carried the tone of superiority started fidgeting, flipping through notes that now seemed irrelevant. No one knew how to follow up. How do you move to the next question when the previous one cracked open the entire premise of the conversation? You don't. You stall. You smile awkwardly. You hope the moment passes. But this one didn't. It's rare to witness genuine disruption in a media environment so tightly controlled. But that's what this was. A disruption not just of a single segment, but of the illusion of order. The producers could feel the narrative slipping through their fingers, live, in real time. And the more they tried to recover, the more obvious it became that they had lost control. The screen may have still shown composed faces, but behind those expressions was a storm of uncertainty. Afterward, there would be frantic meetings, damage control, maybe attempts to reframe what had been said or question the speaker's credibility. But none of that would erase the moment itself. The truth had been spoken in a place where it wasn't supposed to be. It had bypassed the usual filters and landed straight into the public consciousness. And that was something no cut, edit, or commercial break could undo. Viewers at home knew exactly what they had witnessed. The shift was obvious. A calm studio had turned into a battleground. Not because of yelling or theatrics, but because someone finally dared to speak without fear, and everyone else realized they were powerless to stop it. Every so often, a moment happens on live television that doesn't just shake the room, it shifts the ground beneath it. This wasn't just a guest making waves or a controversial segment designed to boost ratings. It was something deeper, more consequential. In the span of just a few minutes, a single voice changed the tone of an entire conversation, and in doing so, disrupted the rhythm of the media machine that thrives on control, predictability, and manufactured outrage. The words spoken weren't just challenging, they were clear, composed, and surgically precise. The delivery wasn't dramatic, and that's what made it all the more powerful. No yelling, no emotional manipulation, no theater. Just truth laid out like a blueprint. It wasn't said to provoke, it was said because it needed to be heard. And once it was, there was no walking it back. The audience didn't just hear facts, they felt them. They sensed the confidence behind the message. The kind of confidence that only comes from someone who has seen the system from the inside and decided not to stay silent anymore. This was more than just an uncomfortable moment for the hosts and panelists. It was a wake-up call for viewers across the country, people who had started to question whether the media they consume every day is telling them the whole story. They watched as someone calmly explained how narratives are built, how dissenting voices are silenced, and how the truth is often buried under layers of pre-approved messaging. They saw someone expose the mechanics of control in real time, not through speculation, but through first-hand understanding. There was something deeply unsettling for those behind the scenes. They had invited a guest, perhaps expecting a polite, controlled exchange, something they could frame neatly before cutting to commercial. But what they got instead was a message so direct, so irrefutable, that it rattled the very foundation of the segment. And as the seconds passed, it became clear that this wasn't just another guest appearance. This was a moment that would ripple far beyond the studio. For the audience at home, the impact was immediate. Social media lit up. Messages were exchanged. People leaned forward in their seats, not out of entertainment, but out of awareness. It was the realization that someone was finally saying the things they had been thinking for years, things that were always danced around but never spoken plainly on air. This wasn't about left or right, conservative or liberal. This was about truth breaking through the noise, for once not filtered through a producer's hand or a carefully crafted press release. And while the people on set scrambled to regain footing, the viewers had already made up their minds. They had seen something real, and they wouldn't forget it. They watched as typical power dynamics reversed. The people who usually control the conversation were suddenly silent. The people who usually asked the tough questions had none to give. It was one of those rare moments where the truth came through so clearly that no amount of damage control could dilute it. You could sense that the power structure in the room had shifted. The audience was no longer just watching passively. They were witnessing someone challenge the machinery head-on, and not in a hostile way, but with facts that couldn't be disputed. That calm, assured tone carried more weight than any dramatic argument ever could. And for a brief but unforgettable moment, viewers got a glimpse of what real transparency looks like. This moment wasn't just a televised confrontation, it was a signal. A signal that people are ready for more than polished punditry, that they want voices who don't fear losing invites or stepping on toes or offending power. They want truth, no matter how uncomfortable, and they want it delivered by people who have lived it, not just studied it. When it ended, there were attempts to change the subject, to soften the blow, to pretend nothing had happened. But it had. And no one who watched it live could deny it. Something important had been said, and more importantly, it had been heard. What unfolded that day wasn't just an ordinary media segment, it was a disruption. A rare, unscripted moment when the truth pierced through the noise and shattered the illusion of control. For years, audiences have grown weary of the carefully curated conversations, the manufactured outrage, and the convenient avoidance of inconvenient facts. But in that single broadcast, the tide shifted. It reminded everyone watching that there are still voices willing to cut through the pretense and speak with clarity and conviction. The media world has long operated on a framework of predictability. Guests are prepped, topics are framed, and discussions are steered to avoid turbulence. But every so often, someone steps into that space and refuses to play by those rules. Not by shouting or grandstanding, but by calmly laying bare what others have tried to hide. That's what made the reaction so intense. It wasn't just the words. It was the undeniable truth behind them. The network couldn't mute it. The hosts couldn't refute it, and the audience couldn't unhear it. And then came the fallout. Not in headlines or press releases, but in the silent panic etched across faces, in the scrambled efforts to shift the narrative, and in the stunned quiet that followed. It was clear to anyone paying attention that something extraordinary had just happened. Not a scandal, not a viral stunt, a moment of pure, unfiltered honesty that couldn't be spun or suppressed. Viewers recognized the magnitude instantly. They saw the fear behind the forced smiles, the hesitation in the next question, the unease in the sudden change of tone. That wasn't performance. It was vulnerability. It was the visible result of a media structure being challenged from within its own walls. And that's what made it so compelling. It reminded people that truth still has the power to shake foundations. What matters now isn't just what was said in that studio, it's what comes next. Will more voices rise to challenge the dominant narratives? Will more moments of unfiltered truth find their way into the public discourse? That remains to be seen. But one thing is certain. The spell of scripted television was broken, if only for a few moments. And in those moments, a new expectation was born. an expectation for honesty, transparency, and courage. The audience is changing. They're no longer satisfied with being talked at. They're demanding to be told the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. And that day, they got a glimpse of what that looks like. Not through viral theatrics or shallow sound bites, but through calm defiance and unwavering clarity. It wasn't just a guest appearance, it was a declaration, a warning shot to a system that's been too comfortable for too long. And the most powerful part? It didn't come from shouting. It came from silence that followed the truth, because everyone knew they had just heard something real. And real